Hello and welcome. We're all used to the government playing a certain role in our lives and sometimes more than necessary. But will that change and can that change? Well, I've got with me someone who's written a book called The Solution Revolution, where he argues that the role of government will fundamentally change and the traditional method of delivering services is not working. And there's a new breed of entrepreneurs and solution providers coming. Well, I'm joined by Bill Eggers, Global Director of Public Sector Research at Deloitte. Bill, thank you very much for speaking with us.
It's great to be here today.
Right. Bill, so tell us, I mean, what you're advocating is something pretty radical, and at the same time it's already happening, that the traditional role of government as seen as the deliverer of services to improve our lives or take care of us is actually being substituted and being done by a bunch of young entrepreneurs, social innovation experts and so on.
Well, the role of government has been shifting literally for decades throughout the world. Fairly slowly, though, it's being government moving less from direct delivery and more as a commissioner of services. And so we've seen the big increase in contracting out, privatization, and so forth, really all over the world, fairly steadily. But what's happening today is a little bit different. You have an entire economy being built outside of government about societal problem solving, delivering public services, but almost in parallel. And that's social entrepreneurs, double, triple bottom line businesses, citizen change makers themselves who are apt at developing, crowdfunding, ride sharing, impact investing into new ways of solving old problems. And we're talking about literally trillions of dollars of public value are being created. And so then that leaves government with a choice. So what's government's role? Well, government's role is it's still important, but it's no longer providing the solution to every societal problem. It's actually being a solution recruiter and creating an environment where these problem solvers can thrive.
Right.
And it's trying to accelerate this.
Right.
That's the best governments, that they understand this.
Right. So let me ask you now, I know what you're talking about is a different set or a different breed of solution providers, but non-government organizations or NGOs were in some ways definitionally supposed to fill that gap in the past. What's the fundamental difference between that group and what you're talking about?
Well, first of all, throughout most of the world, civil society in terms of NGOs was fairly small compared to both the government sector and the business sector. They were small in scale, they were locally developed, they weren't necessarily scaled up. And so a lot of problems still went unsolved, and they didn't have a lot of capital. And if they had a great idea, they didn't have any way of scaling it because there was no kind of venture capitalist for social services, right? That's changing. What we're seeing now is a new breed of organizations, hybrid organizations, social enterprises, which a lot of them both make a profit, but they're trying to have a social mission. And they're built from the beginning to try to scale, very, very quickly. When you think about here in India, to have a real impact, you have to be able to serve millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of people over time. And so you have to have a model that won't just operate in one neighborhood, but that can operate in many states.
In scale, like a real business, which is, so that's the fundamental difference.
Yes.
So give us some examples of such enterprises which have caught your attention in the last, in the recent past, maybe in India or even in the US, Africa, and so on.
Sure. From an emerging market perspective, there's lots of interesting things going on. There's an organization called Bridge International Academies, which is providing very, very low-cost education using a franchise business model. They're charging about $4 to $5 a month. It's a private school network, and they went from one school to over 200 schools just in a few years. They're building a school once a week, and the interesting thing is that they've gotten a lot of their money from traditional venture capitalists, from the Omidyar network, from Pearson, a major education provider, and they just got another tranche of $50 million from the OPEC, the Overseas Private Investment Corporation. Now there's also a similar one operating here in India called Ginshela, and that's also operated within that sort of model of we're going to take the franchise model that applied to business and apply it to education. Now here in India, I think you've got a lot of interesting innovation going on in healthcare. Some of the best low-cost healthcare in the world. India's these companies are using, like Aravind Eye Hospital, which of course is very famous, and Maternity Health Spring, and Narayana Health. They're all applying kind of a specialization model. So they're saying that the way to get the costs down is to just do cardiac surgeries, or to just do cataract surgeries, or to just do births.
And do thousands of them.
And do thousands, tens of thousands of them sometimes. And so they've been able to get the cost down radically lower than in the United States with very high quality at the same time. So they're serving sometimes, our event's serving over 300,000 people, but the question is now, the next stage is how do you get that up to the millions,
Right.
to where they're across the entire country. And so a lot of these is about first innovating and then scaling.
Right. So let me come back to the point that you made about government. You said government needs to now start thinking like a solution recruiter.
Yes.
Right. So how does that play out? What is the manifestation, and more so in countries like India where we need the other side to work efficiently?
Well, it means, first of all, a change in mindset. So instead of looking at any issue or service or problem and saying, how can we solve that problem if you're a government official? The first question should be, how can we involve the community, the private sector, social enterprises, and others in solving that problem? So it's about a very different mindset. And who can we involve, and how can we facilitate the solving of the problem as opposed to doing it ourselves? And that creates a very different sort of mentality. The governments can also act as kind of a VC of sorts. There's a lot of social innovation funds that we've seen. Big Society Capital in the UK is a $1 billion fund right now, which is investing in social enterprises, trying to create a market for social outcomes. There's India's Inclusive Innovation Fund, which is now at about $50 million, hopefully getting up to $100 million, and ultimately they want to get it up to $1 billion. And so that can help provide some of that seed funding that's very needed. But you also have to clear out a lot of the regulatory hurdles. You need to make it legal. You need to open up procurement to all of these organizations. The average social entrepreneur has no way of getting into the procurement dollars now, and government is still the big buyer of healthcare and education and transportation and water and so forth in most countries in the world.
Right, and we were speaking a little while ago, right? Water being an example.
Right.
I mean, you don't see the kind of entrepreneurial energy being poured into a problem like water as perhaps in some other areas. And this is perhaps something that a government could direct and say, hey guys, I have a problem here. Why don't all you guys sit together and knock your heads and come up with something? Maybe potable water, maybe industrial water, effluents, and so on.
Yeah, and around water, what we're seeing is that we are seeing actually a lot of innovation from the private sector and social entrepreneurs in terms of clean water, in terms of taking water and giving it clean water. Right now, about 1 billion people around the world lack access to clean water, and so we're seeing a lot of interesting things going on there, very low-cost models too. What we're not seeing as much innovation in is just dealing with the fact of water provision in general. The fact that maybe throughout lots of the West and developing world, there's just not enough water. And I do think that will change, and governments can do things to basically get the pricing right, to create a marketplace to encourage that sort of innovation, whether through funding, through
Right.
prizes and challenges, and through a variety of other mechanisms.
Right, so last question. So how can I as an entrepreneur be part of this solution revolution?
You know,
Or wannabe entrepreneur?
the great thing about today compared to 10, 15 years ago is that if you have a really good idea, you have a business model that can scale and so forth, there's actually money out there here in India, in the United States, in the UK, and elsewhere, because there's a whole class of impact investors. There's now 18 kind of large mutual-like funds, impact funds here in India that are providing seed money. And what we always keep hearing is that there's not enough good ideas with entrepreneurs who can scale them for the amount of capital there is. So it's really thinking about that, is the funding's there, but then you really have to think about here from an India context is not just what's the idea, but how are we going to take that and scale it up from a management and technical perspective to where it can scale up to meet the needs of millions of people. And that becomes the key thing. That's going to take a lot of talent, and getting the right talent into the organization too.
Right, so let me then ask you that as the last question. So this obviously needs a higher degree of skill and application of talent than perhaps your traditional non-government organization, which is,
Right.
Which is normally a creation of circumstances than
Yes.
anything else. So how is that going to come together?
Well, I'll tell you what's happening right now in the United States is that in business schools, and you're seeing this elsewhere, is that there's whole tracks for social enterprise. You can basically focus on social entrepreneurship in business schools, and the social enterprise clubs are the most popular clubs in business schools. So people are kind of learning a lot of those skills, and they're, a lot of the general entrepreneurial skills, but applied towards the social means. And I think that's going to make a difference, a really big difference over time. There's also lots of training for NGOs and others to how can they operate in a more kind of business-like fashion. I think there needs more kind of academies around that. But we're also going to be seeing, I think, as a lot of people who have made a good living, who have been successful, for instance, in the tech industry here, will look at and say, you know what, I'm 60 years old, I'm 55 years old, I want to now give back to India and go in there and try to build kind of the social innovation and that sort of a sector. And that's going to be really, really key for also making this, taking it to the next level.
Right, and of course, not the most important, but an important point about the government itself changing its mindset to really spur this entire thing on.
Absolutely. Government's a really important player.
Right. Bill Eggers, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.